All right, I think we can start. Do you want to give a quick intro and then I'll flip on my poll and then head back off?
How about you go first, Thomas, if you don't mind?
Okay. Welcome everybody. Thank you for taking part this evening in this webinar as in part of our larger webinar series this week. So hopefully you all can at least participate in as many as you can and get something out of it. Quick housekeeping item. I have a quick poll that I'm going to launch here, non-related to Grant. If you don't mind just responding quickly, just want to get a bit of an overview of your familiarity with Extempore and see if you attended the webinar yesterday with Sam. And then after that, I will hand things back over to Grant and we can dive right into everything. Right, almost there. Give it another 20 seconds. All right, 5 more. All right, I will end it there. So thank you, everybody. I can share quickly if anybody's interested. Most people pretty new, I guess, kind of a mix, and a mix of people's comfort levels. So, all right. Grant, I will hand it off to you.
Thanks, Thomas. Guys, thank you guys so much for being here tonight. It's really exciting to talk to you guys about using Extempore for read alouds and dictation. I'm like super nerd about these topics and language teaching. So it's just really glad that you guys could make it tonight and watch this presentation on how we can use Extempore for read alouds and dictation. And also why in the world should you use these two teaching strategies in the first place? Again, I'm Grant. It's nice to meet you. I'm Extempore's community manager. And I'm not just some random guy who's doing this presentation. I'm also a Chinese teacher here in Minnesota at Mount Westonka High School in Minnetrista. So without further ado, let's get into it. So what are we doing today? Let's learn a bit about what we're talking about today. So my background, again, I am a Chinese teacher. Excuse me. I've been teaching Chinese for 3 years now. I got my master's in 2018 from Towson University in Maryland. And I got to Extempore back in August, and I've been doing all sorts of content creation. I do webinars like this. I help teachers, learn how to use the product, learn how to design it best for how they want to use it in their class. So that's a little bit about myself and what's today going to look like. So first, we're going to talk about oral reading and reading aloud. I'm going to use those terms interchangeably. A little bit of background. Why should we use oral reading? A little bit of background research on it, all of the research that's been done that shows why we should use it, how we should use it, and then a little bit of my classroom and personal experience with oral reading. Finally, with oral reading, we'll do a little bit of an Extempore how-to. I'll show you guys how to configure oral readings directly on Extempore, super simple. And then we'll switch gears and we'll go to dictations and we'll talk about the same stuff. We'll say, why should we use dictations? What's the benefit? I'll give you guys some research again, talk about my experience, and I'll give you guys a little bit of a how-to on how to make dictations on Extempore. So without further ado, let's jump into the meat of this. Let's talk about oral reading. Oh yes, sorry. And a Q&A at the end, of course, as time, when time permits. So oral reading. I really like this meme. I think it's really funny. It sucks when I read as read and not read. So I have to reread read as I have to reread. You get it, right? You get it. It's a little bit of a tongue twister because you have to know what the context is giving you and how to pronounce R-E-A-D in this text. And that just kind of shows oral reading aloud is there's a lot going on in our brains when you do it, and especially when it's in a foreign language. So that's pretty much what we're going to be talking about in this section. So let's look into it. Why should we do this? Oh, of course, God, I'm getting ahead of myself. Slow down. How often do you guys use oral reading in your classes? I'm curious. I just want to know a little bit about your guys' experiences before we get into this. So Thomas is going to pop up a poll real quick, and you'll be able to choose. I believe it's often, not so often, and then almost never. So he's going to put that up. And there we go. Yeah, and we'll do dictations here too. And we can talk about that. We can see a little bit of a background there. Take your time, take about a minute, look at these, and then Thomas will be kind enough to show us some results of what's going on.
Yep, we're almost there. Grant, I'm guessing you can see that too.
Yeah, I can see the bolt. I can see
Okay.
I'm just going to keep it up until it closes. Take your time. There's no rush. And it's okay if you never use them. There's nothing wrong with that. That's what we're going to learn about tonight. All right, Thomas, the big reveal. Ooh, man. All right, we got some experience. A little bit of experience with read alouds and some good experience with dictations as well. Awesome. All right, so let's look at why in the world we should use oral reading aloud. Again, I'm going to use those terms interchangeably. Garalatos is one of the sources that I chose for this, and he mentions that it's reading out loud, just to be specific, it's not the teacher reading text that right in front of them. It's the students taking what they're seeing, taking what they're reading, and reading it out loud. And one of the things I wanted to talk about with oral reading today is that it's not really affiliated or associated with any of these, I'm gonna use my pointer, it'd be fancy zoomer, with these modern teaching techniques, so to speak. You know, when you think of reading out loud, you think, oh, well, they're just reading from a text. How is that, you know, what's so great about that? And then on the same page, he mentions that especially with a lot of the training with language teachers and the pedagogy of language teachers today, a lot of our focus is on, you know, communicative competence. We need to be using the language to communicate a message. How can we get our kids to start talking and start doing something with the language? Well, when you think of oral reading, you don't exactly think of, you know, communicating a message. It's not like you're going to write down your order before you go to a restaurant and order something in French. That would be really weird, and it'd be like a social faux pas. So then at the end of the day, what purpose does oral reading have for us? But before we get to that, I want to ask you guys another question in the chat. Why do you think oral reading is perceived this way? And how do you perceive it yourself? Like, why does it get this kind of bad rep that it's this, you know, outdated and really too traditional method of teaching? So I'm going to invite you guys to respond away in the chat. Let me know what you think. Why do you think oral reading has this kind of reputation to it? And how do you feel about oral reading? Take your time, take a minute or two. Give a little response. Feel free to share. Let's see what you guys say. Okay. Associated memorized learning. Yeah, I like that, Mercedes. That's a good answer. Yeah. And one of the things, just to get you guys thinking, some of the thoughts I had about this, a lot of emphasis on function over form, right? Oral reading might sort of tend to emphasize form as opposed to the function of the language. You're not really using it to do something. You know, communicative competence I mentioned, comprehensible input, what's the relation to that? And then the other, just more broadly speaking, is that oral reading, you know, what kid goes to the language, goes to Spanish class, goes to Chinese, goes to Japanese class, and be like, oh boy, I can't wait to read out loud today. You know, like, it's not seen as the most engaging teaching strategy. Let's see what we got. So Catherine says, kids aren't focusing on meaning or grammar, they're just struggling to get through the pronunciation. Sure. Wendy says it's perceived as rote. There's no real meaning for students necessarily, especially when they may be focusing on pronunciation rather than meaning. Yeah, these are good answers. Anybody else want to share? Feel free to share. Excuse me. Then we're going to look at why. John says people do it in real life. Yeah, and there are plenty of occasions where oral reading really comes to play in real life. But I think at least in the classroom, it can kind of, you know, maybe get a bad rep. So, all right, thank you guys for your responses. Let's see why we should do this. Okay, what do we got? Oral reading's place in the classroom. First reason, prosody. When we read out loud and we are forced to read these much longer stretches of text, you can focus on the different elements of speech that are present. And when you read more, you can raise awareness of how you read. And so that eventually your speech becomes much more natural, and practicing them so that the words flow in as natural sounding a manner as possible. right? And when we do that, the more we read aloud and we practice getting that prose down, that you would think can eventually translate into our natural speech. So that's one reason. Secondly, comprehension. And you might not think this right away, but oral reading can definitely indicate a student's level of comprehension with a text, right? If you have a question, is it read as a question? If you have a dialogue between two people that students are reading out loud, could be about anything. It could be somebody ordering food at a restaurant. It could be somebody buying a plane ticket. It could be saying goodbye to your parents and you're not going to see them for 2 more years. Or it could be a couple having an argument. There are so many different scenarios that are possible that allows for so many different possibilities of a way that a text could be read. And so when a student reads a text properly and they know what's going on, they're going to read it with the correct pronunciation, the correct tone, and all of the cadence and intonation that goes into natural speech that we have every day. And finally, oral reading is a skill, believe it or not. As an example, it is hard work reading aloud from a book. It can be tricky to get the correct intonation, and you may find you often have to reread bits to make them sound right. Reading aloud tends to require considerable attention. Now, you can see that was rather very unnatural for me. It sounded like, oh man, he's reading out. He must not be very comfortable reading out loud, or he must not be very comfortable with the language, or he must, he needs to practice a little more. Right? You can tell that sounds really not natural, as opposed to reading aloud tends to require considerable attention, right? You know what good reading sounds like and what good reading doesn't like. And imagine trying to do that in a language that you're trying to learn. And in even more particular, in my case, teaching Chinese, perhaps even with a script you might not even be familiar with. That's when it really becomes a skill. And so for that, I'll tell you, reading aloud, it's not just reading correctly. There's so much that goes into it. So now, giving you a little bit of background, how do I use reading aloud? How do I use oral reading in my classes? For one, given that I teach Chinese, for developing character recognition and linguistic awareness through repetition and eventually striving to get that automaticity, right? You see a character, boom, you know how to pronounce it. Because if you see a character you don't know, you're not going to know how to pronounce it. So you got to keep going, repetition. And so an example, simple, is these two words, 觉得, to think, and 睡觉, to sleep. You'll notice the highlighted yellow character has two different pronunciations. Yes, that's a thing in Chinese. And so the students have to practice these words to say 觉得, and not 觉得 or 睡觉. It just sounds so weird in my mind because I know these words so well. But that type of repetition with oral reading can build that automaticity that we strive to get our students to achieve in language learning. So that's one way. Another way is for them to use emotion when they speak, which I have just been so hard on them about. Like, use emotion. When you learn a new language, you don't just forget all of the emotion and tones that you use in your native language. So for example, in English, we say really when we're curious about something. Really? In Chinese, 真的吗? 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 Not 真的吗? 真的吗? Use emotion. Come on. Show me that you know what you're reading, right? In Spanish, verdad, vraiment, I believe in French. So stuff like that, right? You can really show your emotion with another language. It's okay. You're allowed to do that. And reading out loud, oral reading is just one of the easiest situations to get my students to do that. So that's something I like. And then finally, having them illustrate their comprehension of a passage. Oh, excuse me. Sorry, I have one more. Because like I mentioned, when you're reading out loud, when you read 真的吗 as 真的吗 and you sound really curious, well, then you know what 真的吗 means. You know what that means. The same thing if, given the situation, if you're having an argument, you're exchanging pleasantries with somebody, you're talking about the weather. There's a certain tone, there's a certain cadence to how you speak. And that cadence, though you're not going to know if your students understand everything, they can illustrate their comprehension based on how they read. And then finally, the most basic reason is simply to get them speaking before class every single day. I give my students daily oral readings. It takes them 3 minutes to do right in the beginning of the day, right before our first period class. And it's the easiest way. It's no pressure speaking. They have a text right in front of them. It's a great vocabulary review. And it gets them speaking right away with no strings attached. So I love it purely for that reason. So that's a little bit of my experiences. And so I hope now I will ask you, are you content with this content, or do you feel deserted in the desert with no dessert? So just think about, even with English, where words are stressed is a huge emphasis when you are reading out loud. Alrighty, onward. So a poll for you guys. How would you right now think to implement oral reading in your present language classes? In what ways might you use it? Could you do skits? Could you do daily practice like I have? What do you guys think? Share with me in the chat. Let me know. Take your time. No pressure. I'd be happy to hear some of your guys' strategies, or even if you already use it already. I'd love to hear what you guys do. Oh yeah. Tweets, news bits, love it. Yeah, absolutely. Lines of characters from educational videos, sure, yeah. Any examples, John, specific? Combining oral reading with other comprehensive and interpretive tasks. Read aloud with a partner after a quick write. Reading a skit. I think skits are perfect. Volleyball reading, perfect, yeah. Right, because skits, like you get to act, you get to show your emotion, I don't know, I'm trying to think of something to say in Spanish. A mí me gusta la pizza mucho. Something like that, I don't know. Have students read a text out loud with mics off as they enter a Zoom classroom while I'm taking attendance. A bell ringer, yeah, perfect. Breakout room to have pairs practice skits, conversations, perfect, yeah. I love, skits are perfect because, again, there's no pressure. They have it right in front of them. And so often you can get students reading their skits at the front of the class. These are my lines. This is a line that I have to read. Use your emotion, right? And then you could have your students grade them and be judges as to how well they read. Plenty of different ways to engage oral reading in your class. So let's see then how we can create some oral readings directly on Extempore, shall we? I'm going to come out of my screen. I'm going to go to my classes, and boom, here we are in Extempore. We have our winter wake. Oh man, I was all over the place. Winter wake webinar up class. Lovely. Well done, Grant. We'll create an assessment. We'll say oral reading practice. Here we are. Start it now. Make it do in a couple months because students are a little slow these days. Okay, individual, of course, they're going to respond with audio. In the assessment description, I like to just put a little blurb. This is oral reading practice. Please read twice. And that's one thing I like to have my students do, especially with shorter texts, and we'll see that when I talk about some factors you need to consider with oral reading. Make them read it twice. Reading once is good, but twice it builds the repetition. It builds the repetition so that they can't just say, oh, I read through it. Finally, I got through it. No, read it again. Do it again. There's so much of language learning is practice and repetition and more repetition. All right, let's go to next. And now we can add our question. So I'm going to go to our question. I'm going to say set one. I call them sets because I do two at a time. I might have a dialogue first, and then I'll have a little narrative text afterward, or I'll have a narrative text first and a dialogue afterward, mixing up the style of text that I use. So not just, random sentences, but some actual structure to it. So for example, but for this, I'll keep it simple. I'll do some basic Chinese. 你今天怎么样? 你今天怎么样? And 你喜欢做什么? Right, so what are you today and what do you like to do? And then in English, how is the weather today? What do you like to do? So anything like that. These are not direct translations. These are just random examples, but you put your text here, space them out however you want. And then you're ready to go. One other thing I want to note is that, yeah, sure, you can absolutely add your own audio recording of how these are pronounced. If you want your students to get practice simply just mimicking your pronunciation, because again, that's what good language learners do, is they learn to mimic, they learn to copy how other people speak. So if you want, there's no reason why you can't include your own recording of this. That's absolutely fine. Or even you could highlight a specific word, right? So if I wanted to highlight zuo, my students might say zuo instead of zuo. I can record, I can say, hey, make sure you pronounce this sound this way. You can give them little tips beforehand. So that's totally okay. All right, so we're ready to go. I'll hit next. And just like that, my oral reading practice is all done. I'm ready to go. Okay, now I go to my student. Oh, my Zoom is in the way. Okay, now I go to my student, find my class, my Winter Wake Webinar Up class. I'll hit refresh, and it should be there waiting for me. Alrighty, there we are. Oral reading practice, not due till July 10th. Got plenty of time. Okay, I can hit this. See my oral reading practice, read it twice. Okay, I'm ready to go. I jump in. I have my texts and my recording. As soon as I'm ready, hit record. I get a little countdown, which is always nice. And I can start going. 你今天怎么样? 你喜欢做什么? How is the weather today? What do you like to do? Right, and just like that, boom, done. 6 seconds. Talk about easy. I'm all done. If I want to, I can play it back, submit my attempt, and woohoo, I have completed all of my oral reading practice questions. Fantastic. So now I'm done. I can go to my grading, fresh, and I can grade. And I have my student response. And one thing I like to do with student responses, and I don't know if I'm the only one who does this, but I think it really makes it personal, is I'll take video feedback, and I'll stand right here, hey, and I will literally record myself and then play their recording. 你今天怎么样? 你喜欢做什么? How is the weather today? What do you like to do? And I will just chop at it, bits and pieces. So like I might say, okay, listen here, Grant. 你今天怎么样? Whoa, slow down. You're speaking way too fast. Something like that. Whatever you want to do. So I have a recording, they can see it, use video. And my students, I will do this. I'm lucky I don't have too many students, so I can do this for them. I'll submit a video, and then boom, they have feedback, just like that. So that is Oral Reading 101 on Extempore. And now we can talk about, not dictations just yet, but a little bit of, not warnings, but just some advice when it comes to creating oral readings directly on Extempore. So for example, some factors we should consider. 1, your text length. Why? Because how long will it take your students to read? And however long it takes your students to read is going to directly impact how long it will take you to grade. They are directly proportional. 2, vocabulary. I feel personally that students should know at least 90%, if not more, of the words. Because if they don't know certain words, and particularly if they're not cognates, well, the student's not going to be able to guess right away what it means. And that is also going to influence how well they can read it. They might be able to pronounce the word right in front of them, if it's mirar, for example. But if they don't know what mirar means, then they're going to have trouble, using the right intonation. That might impact how they read it. Again, they might pronounce it correctly, but again, the tone and cadence could be impacted by words that they're not familiar with. Of course, this is particularly important for languages with new scripts. And languages like Chinese or Japanese, where characters are involved and they literally can't read it if they don't know how it's pronounced. So vocabulary is important. Again, the more vocabulary they know, the more comfortable they will be. And then purpose. What is your purpose? Do you want to chunk, where you work on taking parts of a sentence and where is it important to pause? Where is it logical to pause when you're reading? Or do you want to work on pronunciation? There's stress, right? We talked about being content with content or deserted in the desert. That's stress with language. Or if you have accents in a language, almost any language that uses the Latin alphabet, I believe, almost any language, they'll have, you'll have accents, you'll have charons, you'll have circumflexes, you'll have, accent grave, accent aigu. All of those impact how we pronounce words. Heteronyms, words like that I just mentioned, content and content, desert and desert, D-E-S-E-R-T, read and read and read, geez. Words that are spelled the exact same way, but can be pronounced two different ways. Or for someone like me, teaching a tonal language, Chinese, that can also be another purpose for pronunciation. Emotion. I've said enough about using emotion with oral reading. This is my text. I don't read with emotion. Use emotion. It's part of your linguistic repertoire and your arsenal. It's in you. You just got to get your kids to use it. And then finally, these all depend on how familiar your students are with the language. Obviously, if they're just starting, it's going to be a little hard. It's going to be a little tricky for them to adapt. But with more advanced students, these are definitely more doable and achievable goals. So That, I believe, is oral reading 101. And now let's jump and move to dictation. So I asked earlier, we already did our little poll on this, but I asked earlier, how often do you guys use dictation in your classes? I think it was a little less often than how often we use oral readings. So hopefully I can convince you guys to start seeing the value in these and how we can use them as well. All right, so let's get into it. Dictation 101. How in the world, what is this dictation thing? So dictation, as defined, is the transference of primary auditory language, what we hear, speech, into secondary graphic ones, putting it into writing, right? Taking what we hear, writing it down, whether that's handwriting it or typing it. And so Sutherland, he had a great writing on this, and he also talked about some misconceptions behind dictation and how our interpretation of dictation and how we know it's, a lot of it is sort of skewed because we're not using it the right way. And so much of that depends on, one, when we use it in the classroom, and two, how we use it in the classroom. And so these can greatly sort of cloud, I think, our pedagogical judgments, if I may, on our decisions of whether or not why we should use these things. So again, I'll ask you guys, similar to oral reading, why might dictation get this sort of bad rep? And then along the same lines, what other traditional methods do you guys think still have a place in today's language classroom? I'm just curious. We talk about oral reading and then dictation. He's like, what? Oral reading, dictation, who does that? Well, they have use, but they do get, they're not the first thing that comes to mind in your teacher toolbox. So take your time. I'll stop talking for a second. And let's see what you guys have to say. What we got? Translation, rarely, yeah. It's slow. It seems like a time waste when they have Spanish spell check. Ooh, memorization. John is the rebel. He thinks translation is still valid. He has a lot of memorization, but at the same time, Wendy, what we'll see is that dictation is a great challenger of your short-term memory. I'll give you guys another minute. I need a minute to catch my breath too. Translation and dictation. Yeah, there's a lot of, thinking that translation and dictation sort of go hand in hand, and they were sort of, part of the old school grammar translation method. Bad rep didn't mean, I think it's totally inappropriate. Oh, okay. No, I'm just saying. Yeah, this is why it gets, you say like, oh, I'm doing a dictation today in my class, and people look at you like, who are you? Are you from the 1950s? Like, no, it's totally legit. Like, okay, yeah, go for it. All right. Thank you guys for your participation. Let's jump into it. Okay. What's the deal? What's the deal behind dictation? Why should we use this? What's its place? One, dictation, Casazolu, she wrote a really, really interesting piece on this. All 4 language skills put together. And not just that, short-term memory. So 1, you have to listen to what you're hearing. 2, you have to write it down. 3, you have to read it and know that, okay, is this proper Spanish? Is this proper German, Czech, Croatian, whatever language I'm learning? Is this the way I know it? Is that what's going on? And then 4, speaking. You might not be speaking entirely, but you're hearing somebody else speak. And the more you listen to someone speak, the more they can also influence the way you learn that target language. So that's one thing. 2, it's hard. Dictations are not easy. 1, you have to distinguish different sounds. 2, you have to choose what words do you know in your vocabulary, no matter how limited it is or expanded, can you choose that fit the sounds that you heard from the dictation? 3, you have expectations as to what the language sounds like and how it's supposed to come about versus the reality of what you might be hearing. And so you have that constant battle. And then 4, oh yeah, you have to write it down as fast as you can. So dictations are by no means are they easy. They are very difficult, no matter what language it is. And then finally, again, Casazolu, she mentioned this notion of discovery listening, where you morph together the role of form of the language and its function in the classroom. So you listen to what somebody is saying, and you can focus on not just what they are saying, the meaning of what they're saying, but also the sound, how it sounds. Simple example, and this will come up later, is, in American English, we say schedule. In British English, they say schedule. It's a very simple difference to us. We know what they're saying as well. If you are a native speaker of English, you likely know what they're saying. But to somebody learning English, you say, oh, and they've learned schedule their whole life. You hear schedule, like, whoa, 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 whoa. That's not what I learned. Well, you can do that with this sort of form and function hybrid. You take what somebody's saying, okay, yeah, he's talking about he's going to do something on some certain day. Oh, but did you notice? He also used schedule instead of schedule. What might we get from that? Oh, it's just a regional variation. But there are thousands of different examples of how you can put this form and function together, where you're pointing out, regional variants of a word, how a word is pronounced, what word they use, all sorts of things. And I think that's really valuable when it comes to dictation, and that it's not just some rote memorization activity, although it is a great practice for your short-term memory. Okay, my teaching experiences with dictation. As a language teacher, how do I use dictations to help my students? Let's see. Listening proficiency and text comprehension. Now, listening proficiency, I think, is pretty straightforward. If you're writing down exactly what you hear, well, then clearly you know what you're hearing, and that's important. Now, text comprehension might be a little more, well, what do you mean text comprehension, Grant? What I mean by that is, if I tell a story to my class, I tell a story that has, say, 4 or 5 parts, and then I take a main idea or main line from each part of that story, and I read them to my students. I say, then Xiaoming went to the grocery store. Afterwards, Bai Ping came home to Xiaoming and made dinner, something like that. And I made all sorts of different sentences. I could say, okay, write down these sentences. Now, and this is a dictation reordering task, now put them back in order from when they occurred. So I give you a text, or if we listen to a story, and then I tell you all these things that happened and you write them down, can you put them back in order? That is absolutely text comprehension. So that's one way. 2, it's easy typing practice. Again, just like getting the easy speaking practice beforehand, we learn another language, you need to learn how to type in that language. And especially, languages where you have to get used to a new keyboard system, if you're learning, a new alphabet like Cyrillic or Arabic or Hebrew, or, with French, Spanish, German, so many of the Romance and Germanic languages, they have all of these accents and diacritics. Well, you need to know how to type those. That's practical knowledge. That's practical skill for your language. Finally, or I think this is the third one, strong editing habits, right? When you look at what you've written, does that match what you have learned? Does that match what you have heard? It gets your students really into the mindset of, is what I am writing down, is that proper German? Is that proper French? A lot of good practice with that. And finally, focus. I have mentioned that dictations are hard. They are not easy. Well, if you want to do well in them, you better focus. And that's something I like about it, is that I get my students, they're in the zone, they're listening, they're totally glued in. Okay, what is he saying? What is he saying? I need to listen. It's perfect for building good focus in my students. Alrighty, so another poll for you guys. Now that we've done a little bit of background, how would you implement dictations in your present language classes? I know there are things called like running dictations, where you have sort of your students do it and then they put them in order, or something like what I mentioned. You take a story and you retell parts of the story and you have them put them in order, all sorts of things. Well, I'm curious to hear your guys' thoughts. How would you guys put dictations in your class? Take a minute while I catch my breath. What we got? Warm-ups. Yeah, I love using them as warm-ups. They're really easy. Based on the questions, they need to give oral responses. Yeah, Chicho, that's awesome. That's perfect response. Yeah, give questions. Say, okay, say the question, write it down, and then respond to it. That's excellent. Yeah. It's so basic. It's so simple. Any more? Come on, peeps. Whether they're putting together grammar with sound. Yeah. How do you pronounce here what you are learning in terms of vocabulary and grammar? Yeah. That's awesome. Wendy, I keep reading your last name is Leviathan. Just a random aside, but thought I'd let you know. Yeah, that's great. Yeah. Don't do that. Oh, sorry. Leviathan. Thank you, Wendy. Active participant today. I always love when people are active. Telephone game, just a few students. Yeah, that's, I didn't even think of that. They hear, then they have to tell the next student, and the next student writes it out. Of course, with like any regular telephone game, you could have the one student who totally changes it. You're like, no, what did you do? That's good. Yeah, that's perfect. Awesome. Oh, no. Running dictation. Yeah, John, I like that idea too. Okay, so back into it. Creating dictations on Extempore. Let's do it. How can we create dictations on, no, don't show it. On Extempore. There we go. Okay, we're back. Let's create a dictation. Make an assessment. Dictation 1. Got our timeline. Give them a few months to do it. Okay, but here, the students are not responding with audio. They'll respond with text. So all parameters, again, just in case they don't know, basic directions. This is a dictation. Type what you hear. There we go. No time limits or anything. We'll jump into it. So I'll say, okay, dictation 1 for our title. And then you might think that you wouldn't put anything in the question text, but I like to put something here because they're not going to do anything with this, but simply write what you, or not write, type what you hear, just to remind them of what they have to do. And so first you can upload your own audio and you can mix together, not mix together, but you can mix, you can use a different accent. If you don't want to use your own voice, you can have pre-recorded stuff that you can totally upload. That's cool. You can also use your own audio, which I'll do here. So I might come up with my dictation. So I'll say, let's do something basic in English. Have you heard about the weather today? I think it's going to rain. We might not be able to go to the party anymore. This is really sad. Stop recording. I have my audio and I'm ready to pair it. Now students, all they have to do is listen to that and type it. Say next, just like that, we are good to go. My dictation is ready. Come back to my student page. I refresh. My dictation should be waiting for me. There we go. It's ready. And it's ready for me. Cool. Jump in. I can type what I hear. I'll play it and I'll do it. Why not? I'll do it.
Have you heard about the weather today?
Whoa.
I think it's going to rain.
He's going so fast, right? I can pause it if I need to. I can play it all the way through. I can play it how many times I want. Have you heard? Blah, blah. But the thing is, I don't like to set limits on how many times my students can play it, because if they only had one chance to listen to it and you have like a 30-second monologue that you're saying, it's going to be really hard, no matter how good you are with the language. It's going to be really hard to write it down, all down in one try. So there we go. That's simple. Hit submit. Oh, woohoo, I'm all done. And I'm back to my page. Grading it is just as easy. Go back to my class, my winter wake webinar up class. I'm into my dictation. The easiest thing about dictation is that you know what it is. And there's your answer. There we go. So that's giving a dictation on Extempore. And now I'll come back and I'll give you guys a few pointers on what, no, don't look, it's a secret. On things we should consider when you are making dictations. So the length, the longer the text, the more time your students will need to write it down. If you give them a 3-minute text to write down or a 3-minute audio clip to write down, they're going to be pretty frustrated. Keep it short. I try to limit mine to like no more, at least per question, no more than like, I don't know, 10 or 15 words. I think any more than that, and it's just going to be a lot of going back and listening and making sure it's perfect. Attempts allowed. This is entirely dependent on the dictation, the length of the length of the dictation and the student's level, right? If you have a simple sentence, you know, have you heard about the weather today? I think that's fine. If you want to challenge them and say, oh, okay, you only get one try, that's fine. But if you have like a whole dialogue or multiple, you know, sentences involved, you're probably going to want to give them, you know, free rein on how many tries it takes them. Dictation speed. At the same time, how fast will you read it? Will you read it, you know, there's a fine line. I was thinking about this earlier. There's a fine line between reading it naturally and exactly how we would in the language we teach and scaring our students. So finding that balance can be a little difficult, but think about, you know, do you want to have pauses? How many pauses will you have? Will you pause for a long time? Or will you just say it entirely naturally? And that's up to you. Just things to consider. And then finally, speaker dialect, right? If it's you, whether you speak Spanish and you're originally from Bolivia, or you speak Spanish and you learned it as a second language, or you're from French, you speak French and you're from Marseille, or you're from Sierra Leone, or you're from anywhere around the world, your dialect is going to differ, right? And I gave the example of British versus American English earlier. If your students aren't familiar with that language, with that, that dialect of the language, then it's going to be harder for them to do a dictation. But at the same time, when we use different dialects, that's an opportunity for students to learn and for them to say, oh, I didn't know that they said, schedule instead of schedule. I didn't know that some people in America say soda, some people say pop, some people say Coke. I had no idea. It's an opportunity to learn. And that's something that I love about dictations. It's how many, when you use these different dialects, you can really open up, just new horizons for students, which is cool. So recap, wrapping this all up, oral readings and dictations, why we use them. They're these very traditional methods of teaching, but I think, as you've seen, they obviously have a place in modern language teaching. And the thing that I love about them is that they are so simple to make. They are so simple to make. They are so basic and so easy for students to do. Why would you not do them? They're so easy. And they have so much value. Oral reading helped me tremendously when I was learning Chinese. I would just read out loud every single day, and I grew in confidence more and more. And then at the same time, dictations, you can really, you listen to how someone speaks, especially in a language you're trying to learn. There are so many times you're listening like, oh my God, what did he just say? What did he just say? And you have to listen, 5-10 times to the same recording. It's great, but it's awesome practice too. You can use Extempore for both of these, as you saw, seamlessly create oral reading and dictation assessments on Extempore. And then finally, I have blogs on both of these topics. I was totally nerded out on these, and I wrote like 2,000 words on dictation. So please check them out when you get a chance. Just go to our extemporeapp.com and check out our blog page. And finally, now is an excellent time for a little bit of a Q&A. So if you have any questions, comments, thoughts, concerns, extempore, I don't know, whatever you want to say, any questions or comments, I'd be happy to field them now. Here's some works that I consulted. There's tons of research and literature out there on both of these topics. I would encourage you to seek these out and take a look at them. And just thank you. Thank you so much for attending. You can email me right there, grantcastner@extemporeapp.com, or check us out on Twitter @extemporeapp. We'll be happy to talk to you. Thank you guys so
And then a couple closing remarks.
Thanks, Thomas.
Yeah. As questions come in.
Sure.
For like kind of a little last minute Q&A, if Pam has a question. Before we get into that, there is an exit survey. If you do need to head out right now, please fill it out. That'll help us determine what topics we can provide in the future. And if you have any comments on how we can improve, that would be very helpful. Again, I posted the link somewhere in the chat. I will post it again. I will be uploading the recording for this webinar and all other webinars there, pasting that now. Look for an email later this week for all the recordings. And with that, I'll hand it back off to you, Grant. Looks like there's a question from Pam.
Yes, we got plenty. Yeah. So Pam and Wendy both asked about dictations. Pam says, how would you grade a dictation on Extempore? So one of the things that I've talked to about with some of our developers is that with dictations, when you can we don't have a way to formally create a dictation on Extempore. I'm going to stop sharing if that's okay, so I can actually talk to you guys. We don't have a way to formally grade them, but if a dictation, one of the things you could do would have the text there and then just match the student's words to the text. Now, obviously you can't do that now. So then Wendy mentions, do you go over the dictation in class after the students have completed them? I absolutely do. Yes, absolutely. Yeah. Because it makes it much more of a group experience, a way for you to really look at those specifics, the example of schedule versus schedule. That I think that would really be the best answer. And you can have, I write down what my dictations are, what I'm going to say in a different place, whether it's a Google slide document or where I keep my notes from my class. I write it down and I just see if, as long as it matches it, and eventually you start to memorize the answers and you're like, okay, that one's right, that one's right, that one's right. But again, going over them in class like Wendy suggested is, that's what I would suggest. Yeah. Sheen, how does it work with Canvas? I do not know. Are you talking about Extempore or dictations in general? And then Laureen, we are absolutely posting the link to the presentation. It'll be right on that same landing page that Thomas just shared. It'll be right there. Extempore can integrate with Canvas, and you can you can connect your grades directly to Canvas. Thanks, Laureen. John asked, would you consider a close exercise as an estranged cousin of a dictation? Yes, I would say so. It's almost like it's baby brother, so to speak. Good question, John. Thank you. Please, please, please. I am such a nerd about both of these topics. I love talking about them. So hit me with whatever you got. I'd be happy to answer any other questions about oral reading and dictation. Get your kids reading out loud. It's so easy and it's so good for them. Simply give a credit. Oh, Pam. Oh, I didn't know that's what you were asking. Okay, credit versus accuracy. Yeah. I think that's hard to say. For me, I'm very kind. I would just give a credit. I don't think I would measure them for accuracy, because if they miss like one character or they have a typo here, I don't want to penalize them for a minor mistake. And I think like they'll know when they make mistakes and say, oh, you need to be more careful. You need to be more careful. You could definitely do them as summative assessments. I just think I would just steer away from that for those reasons. Yeah, I like what John said too. You can focus on specific structures instead of just pure accuracy, right? So for example, like in Chinese, in mainland Chinese versus Taiwanese China, the Chinese spoken in Taiwan, there's a very strict difference between certain sounds where they'll say, in mainland they'll say sh, in Taiwan they'll say s. And even there's something like that where you can just get your kids to recognize the difference between those, that I think that in itself is a valuable teaching method. Wendy says, what feedback do you get from students about these two activities compared to others in your repertoire? Ooh, excellent question, Wendy. I don't really get a ton of feedback from them. I don't think they mind them by any means. I think one of the things that one of my students said to me today was, we were talking about, she had to listen to herself present of a recording. And she said, Mr. Kastner, every time you do those recordings and you give us those feedbacks on the oral readings, I just die a little inside after hearing my own voice. So I think, it helps them get used to listening to how they speak the language. And I think that's really important, getting used to how you sound and then getting feedback on how it sounds. I haven't gotten any flack at all from them. And I think, like I said, I think the daily practice is just so helpful. And it can be a little bit to get used to for them, because there's like, what am I trying to say? They have to get into this routine, right? Every single day. So for us, Monday, Tuesday, Friday, you have a daily reading on Extempore. You have a daily reading to do. You have a daily reading to do. So some of them kind of fall behind with that, but once they get into the groove, they say, oh, I have Chinese today, I need to do my reading. I would think that's the best. That's really the type of feedback I can get. Where do I get my texts and sources for oral reading? Jacqueline, thank you. I really appreciate it. Adeline, I don't. I kind of just make them up as I go. I really focus on a lot of it because, again, I think I would say I have a unique situation because I teach Chinese. So much of my oral reading preparation and the texts that I use are based on getting my kids to know these characters. Because when we first learn a character, I'll put it in the chat. Say we learn a character. Well, that's Q&A. Where's chat? We learn a character. I'll say this one right here. Xian. We're learning how to say this character right now. The xian means like first I did this. I need them to get that practice over and over and over of saying xian, 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 right? So that when they read it, it becomes boom, second nature. Boom, second nature. Oh, I know that character. I know that character. Thank you, Pam. Really appreciate it. So, Adeline, to answer your question, I kind of construct them on my own. And I don't, one of the suggestions I would give is do not spend a lot of time composing oral reading. Use what you're talking about, the language that you're using in class, and keep it simple. Again, the longer your text is for oral reading, the longer it's going to take you to grade. And you want it to be pretty simple. So I like to do short dialogues and just very, very short little monologues that somebody might say, like, this weekend I went to the grocery store. At the grocery store, I learned that, the pears were 50% off this week, something like that. Very, very simple, nothing super long. Yeah, I'm with John here. I mean, if you just focus on key vocabulary and grammar structures, I'm not saying everything is grammar, but this is the time to focus on those things. Get those patterns embedded in their mind. If you're working on reflexive verbs and they need to know that the reflexive pronoun always comes before the conjugated verb, well, throw those in your oral readings. Put as many examples as you can. If they need to just read 8 sentences that are all sentences of reflexive verbs, if that gets them to see the pattern in action, that gets them to see how it's used, and they don't have to do anything, all they do is read it, then why not do that? So that's sort of my approach. That's my approach, I think, to really creating oral reading practice. And there's nothing wrong with repetition and doing something over again. I had an exit slip that I used yesterday in my class, and I made the answers. So the exit slip was just a simple text. It was probably 100 words long, not 100 words, maybe 100 characters. And it was fill in the blank. And then for our extempore reading today, I filled in the blanks and I threw it on extempore. And that was what they had to read this morning. It was very simple. It was very brief. Don't hurt yourself trying to come up with oral reading practice. Keep it simple. Oh, come on, hit me. I love this stuff. Yeah. John, I'm with you there. I do that too. I'll choose like a monologue. I'll say a simple, 4 sentences maybe, and then a mini dialogue of 2 characters who are, oh, really? Jandama, really? Something like that. And then something happens and I'm like, oh my gosh, gasp, egad. I love doing dialogues because it allows my students to use emotion. Not that they always do. It encourages them to use emotion.
Any other last minute questions? Otherwise, we'll.
Yes. Thank you, Wendy. It was great to talk to you. I love this stuff. Please contact me if you need anything. Would love to help. Thanks, Lisa. Thank you, Benet.
And please fill out the survey. It should take like no more than 10 seconds.
Do the survey because Thomas is asking you. Thanks, Laureen. If you use present with remote and slides, you don't have to use the remote. Keep the present mode and tabs. You don't have to keep going back and present. Oh my gosh. That's so helpful. I need to screenshot that right now. So it's the present mode in the tab. You don't have to use the remote. Keep it present in the tab.
Oh, that's a pro tip.
That's huge. That's huge, Laureen. Huge. Thank you so much. I'm doing another one on Thursday, and that's going to be really helpful. Thank you so much. I appreciate that. Thanks, John. Appreciate you coming. Good to see you. Dorian, Adeline.
All right, awesome. I'll end it here. And then I'll get the recording. I'll post it online, and you can finally head on out.
Whoosh. Thank you guys for attending. We're going to close now.
All right, take care, everybody. Thanks for coming.
Bye.